The Boys Season 4 has become the latest show that finds itself smack dab in the middle of the current culture wars, the most controversial season of The Boys thus far, just concluded a few nights ago, and it has a lot of people scratching their heads asking the question, has The Boys lost all sense of direction? For some, The Boys has become far too reliant on its shock value. For others, the show has become far too redundant. And of course, for others, the show's venture into the current U.S. events opens itself for some bad faith arguments, especially as the show dives deeper and deeper into this idea of authoritarianism. And that's what we're going to be focusing in on this review today for The Boys. So for today, I wanted to focus on the three lenses of how to understand season 4 of The Boys. I think there are three ways to understand this show. This season has been a satire on American politics and the rise of the anti-woke platform. It has also been a season about the reflection of trauma as the feeling of doom grows ever clearer and more real. And finally, I think this show can be viewed as an exploration of how a country allows itself to fall into a state of Orwellian disrepair. That's how I want to frame this conversation that we're going to be having about The Boys today. And here's something I wanted to note right off the bat. Besides the fact that I will be talking about some spoilers today, but there's also aspects of the real world that are going to come into conversation with this review. It is a coincidence that season 4 of The Boys' story arc revolves around the plot to assassinate a president, only for Trump to find himself mere inches away from death merely 5 days before the season finale of The Boys. However, what's not a coincidence is the show's depiction of political turmoil and how that can be corporatized, how it can be weaponized, how it can be manipulated to incite violence to support a political agenda and someone's own personal interest. That is fundamental in understanding season 4 of The Boys. So let's focus on probably the most fun one to talk about, which is the political noise / cries of criticism of The Boys, especially with the key term of wokeness, which from my current understanding of the definition of wokeness as it is used, it is now, if you disagree with my political views, then that's considered woke. That is my best definition that I've been able to get from online based on how the show has evolved. And I guess that just means that there's a few characters of color in this show and that one of the characters has a romantic partner that is of the same sex, even though that seems pretty on brand for who we know that character to be up until that point. I'm referring to Frenchie, of course. And I guess specifically what's really focusing and driving this discourse on The Boys being woke is Donald J. Trump, who is kind of the central figure to understand The Boys season 4. It really is the kind of, besides being a litmus test into how aware you were of storytelling for the first 3 seasons, it also has become a skeleton key into understanding the psyches of Homelander and what this show is trying to accomplish. And I think there is obviously noise from kind of everybody around this. I think you have one group who we know what that one group is arguing, and they will never be happy with the depiction of Homelander in this show as it compares to Donald J. Trump, former president. You then have another group of people who are now watching this show and see their politics reflected in a show about bad superheroes who do terrible stuff to one another. And I think there's this bias of the superhero genre kicking in where people see this and they're like, wait, why is my political beliefs being distilled in the format of a superhero show where superheroes do really disgusting things? Like, I don't want my values being almost tied to that. Like, this show shouldn't be about that. I think that's the criticism of genre that is being explored in this, where it's just like, we don't give this genre typically the credibility to do this. And I think when I'm watching The Boys, and specifically this season, the one thing that I keep going back to is I'm trying to think of however many other Hollywood projects that for the past 10 years have really like put themselves in the middle of current events storytelling. Some TV shows and some movies have certainly done it, and some feel very relevant. And I think like examples like South Park, that is very much filmed to be week to week. There are examples like Andor on Disney Plus is one that I feel is very ingrained in the current political climate. And there's definitely way more of those. And there's definitely been a few in movies. I can't think of that many that directly parallel / use the imagery of Trump in a metaphorical lens. There have certainly been some that show it outright. I think Spike Lee has been a director who's been more than willing to engage with that, specifically with the ending of BlacKkKlansman, but also with, you see the character that Delroy Lindo wears, the hat that he dons in The Five Bloods, that is engaging with it. But it's still like there's been very few examples that I can think of where essentially a character is a stand-in for Donald Trump. And that's been fascinating to watch because that mode of storytelling, like I said, just hasn't been frequent. And I think some people are being rubbed the wrong way of this. If I had to just guess, season 1 through 3, I think the references were there. I remember a clear example of Homelander basically having a line about a taco salad. Like, some of the iconography of Trump was always in this show, and it has been there since day one. And you knew what the show was parodying. But season 3 ends with a very specific decision, with Homelander killing a guy in front of his crowd and then getting cheered. It is very clearly and obviously a direct parallel to Trump saying that he can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any votes from his supporters. And that's the almost inception to understand season 4 of The Boys. It's become more blatant. It's become more obvious post this moment. And there's a lack of nuance to that discovery of Homelander realizing this. And to me, it's actually the natural indication of stakes growing ever more heightened as the show goes along. Thus, nuance itself takes a back seat as we see these characters kind of become radicalized. For Homelander, it's in violence, but it is really a radicalization that we're feeling throughout all the characters as everything becomes more and more desperate and time becomes all the more ticking. Like, you really feel these characters feeling the strains of this world. And I think that's why the political climate of this show has been so rich, and a reason that I have really enjoyed, spending time week to week with this, because of just how much it's willing to tackle these topics, even if I don't always find them to cover it with the most nuance. Another aspect that I wanted to discuss with The Boys is this idea that The Boys is spinning its wheels with storytelling. And I call this, and I hope this isn't something that someone else has come up with and I'm just stealing it. I don't think it is. But I call this the Game of Thrones-ification of TV, which was during the prime of Game of Thrones. It taught audiences that week to week on a show that only comes out every few years, that is considered high prestige, very influenced in genre, that to be successful, you have to keep shocking the audience and raising the stakes. And it also means that characters can kind of die left and right. And so I think going into The Boys, and then by the end of season 4, kind of looking around and thinking, okay, no one from the main cast is still really dead. There's definitely been some supporting characters that have eaten it along the way. But the initial cast from season 1 is still primarily the initial cast by the end of season 4. And so I think that leaves people frustrated, where they're just like, okay, this is a show about the boys fighting Homelander, but we can't really get there because we know we have to end it there. But all these characters kind of have the armor because they can't be killed till the ending, all that. So I think that's also a bad faith argument into looking into The Boys, which is, again, a serialization and week to week. And it is supposed to have kind of that feel of TV and more traditional TV. I think of like Breaking Bad. The initial cast in season 1 is almost largely the initial cast by the end of its final season up until some of the last few episodes. And then we add a few characters like Saul Goodman in like season 2. Like these casts do stay the same. Like that is the reason people tune in week in, week out. So it doesn't bother me. And I think what people are saying, well, this season doesn't have much story. Again, I think it's that it doesn't have much shocking story in terms of that fundamentally reshapes how the show is orientated. What it does have is this season allows the writers and the team and the actors to work at its own pace and set up characters on the chessboard for the next season, which is the finale. In this season, just to recap a few, we see Hughie grappling with the death of his father and the reemergence of his mom. We see Annie separating from Vought to make good in the world while trying to determine if that is coming from a place of love or guilt from her past transgressions. We have Frenchie, who after finally finding some form of love and peace, grapples with the sins of murders as they torment his newfound relationship. We have A-Train becoming an informant for the Seven and trying to do good. We have the Deep, who is given the chance at redemption only to squander it yet again. We have MM embracing his leader role, knowing the cost of it, and it will so-called desire to be reunited with his family that seems to fall hollow. We have Kimiko's past as it leads to her muteness. We see Homelander discovering a lot about his childhood in order to seek retribution in the hope that such violence will give him peace, in the hope that it will make him a better father figure to Ryan. And then finally, we have Butcher, who's finally given the silver bullet, the answer, the thing that he has sought this entire show, where he can rid the world of not just Homelander, but of all soups. And he is in a battle with himself, quite literally in this show, to see if he has what it takes to take the unthinkable step and commit essentially soup genocide. That is the story plots that we see in play in season 4 of The Boys. So when I hear the argument that this story doesn't have quite literally much story, I think it's bad faith, because I look at that and I say, I understand these characters far more. This season of The Boys has been an exploration of trauma and how that said trauma affects people going forward and how they recover from it. Specifically, I want to spend a few moments focusing on Hughie's story in this one, because I think that has also been a major point of criticism. Essentially, Hughie having an episode where his father dies as he watches his father accidentally kill a lot of people. And then we have an episode, the next one, where Hughie is undercover and basically gets sexually assaulted by Ted Knight in this gimp-like fashion. And I know people had an issue with that depiction and how it was portrayed for jokes in this show. Personally, I found the intent of that moment to, yes, be very comedic, and also kind of just showing the psyches of which Hughie is existing as a character in that moment, where he himself isn't even able to fully process how messed up everything is in his life to get him to that moment, for him to have that experience and for him to essentially be kind of unbothered by it. And I think that is the whole story arc of Hughie this entire season, because he's a character that's constantly being pushed down to the ground. And then when the season finale comes and he's given the choice to do good, he always kind of rises to that occasion. And I think that makes Hughie the compass, the moral compass of this show largely. And that's why I find scenes like that to work, because I think that payout comes out later when we see him after being tested, after seeing the worst of soups, still be able to love, still be able to care, and still have a form of optimism and belief in people that none of the other characters are able to have. And it makes Hughie the best of them all. And I think that's also what makes the show work so fundamentally well, is that he can go through that and still feel that. And that's what I really like about the actor Jack Quaid's portrayal of Hughie. I think it's a very nuanced performance to get out of Quaid. And then finally, I think we should talk about The Boys as an exploration of how a country allows itself to fall into a seemingly state of Orwellian disrepair. And for me, while watching this season, this tone shifted to that of an apocalypse incoming. It actually reminded me a lot of Doctor Strangelove this way, where everything feels so bureaucratical in its nature in this season. And it's ridiculous where the point of disinformation is spread so widely that no one can seemingly understand what's true, what's not, what's actually a big deal, what's just overblown by the media. And in that way, it's topical. It's exploring how disinformation is spread, how corporations possess the power to essentially control news media, the privatization of power, and truly who has enough power and willingness to be sick and cruel to search for such power. That is a really fascinating thing that this season of The Boys really explores, is the quantification of power. Almost this idea like there is a limited amount of power willing to go around. Most people are too stupid to understand how to obtain power. And then the ones that are smart enough not to seek said power. In this case, we're introduced to a character of Sister Sage, who is smart enough to understand how to obtain power, but is immoral enough to actually go and seek power. And we finally get to her in a final moment of this season. And again, spoiler alert, when it's all come to plan, when it's all come to a head, when the conspiracy theory has happened, she quite literally just says point blank, the reason I did this was to see if I can. And that's the evilness of this show in many ways. It's the lack of empathy. It's the lack of care. And that nuance and that cruelty is where this show just, I thought, thrived in its finale. I think this finale is one of the best episodes The Boys has ever put out. I found it so shocking, so upsetting in multiple moments. I didn't know how it was going to end or where it was going. And yet by the end, I had a clear understanding of what this show was. And I think Sister Sage's line there that I just quoted explains it. And I think where this show's final 10 minutes, you understand what is at stake for the next season. Essentially, the boys have lost. Homelander is all-power authoritarian figure in America. He is commander-in-chief. And what that has at stake for a country, and what that has in stake for its people, its citizens, and for the rest of the world, it is quite literally, this season is Homelander now has the ability to shape this country in his own image. An image that he himself finds so fraught. An image that he himself doesn't fully understand. And when he's challenged or trying to explain it, you see him stutter. You see him fall. The moments of weakness from Homelander, and again, Anthony Starr gives an incredible performance week to week. The moments of weakness that we see from him are him being challenged. When someone just asks him the basic question of how, he is such an uninsightful character in that way that violence is the only way that he understands on how to make anything happen. And even his violence is quite idiotic most of the time. Most of the time he's not in control of his emotions, I should say, that he himself can't get anything done right. And it's a big issue throughout this entire season. And so to now see him where this show ends for this season, to have the utmost of power, you are seeing essentially a child tyrant run amok. And that's where I think this season, or I should say next season, is leading towards. America under the shape of Homelander and Homelander himself not understanding his own psyche to really shape anything, and how that's going to anger him and frustrate him. And where you also leave off is every character is now defined on where they're going. So when we're talking about this idea of how does a country allow itself to fall into a seemingly state of Orwellian disrepair, look no further than someone like Homelander being able to corporatize and possess all power, and how easy it was for him to do it. All the warning signs are there, and this season 4 is a show about warning signs. And yet, when it all comes down to it, a little bit of disinformation, a little bit of riling up the crowds, and all of a sudden, power can be privatized and owned by an authoritarian figure with little to no resistance and very little public awareness. And that's scary. And that's the mood of season 4 of The Boys. And it's why I found it a fascinating exploration of TV, and especially TV that exists in the year of an election. I thought The Boys season 4 was really worth your time, and I would highly recommend checking it out. This might be my favorite season of The Boys. I will be fully honest. For me, I've said it, I think the show gets better and better with each season, and it builds upon its ideas. And where we are now is, I think The Boys season 4 has quite literally become one of the sharpest, one of the funniest, one of the most upsetting mirrors into American society and American politics as it exists in the age that it does now. And that's fascinating to me. And I really appreciate that the show's willing to go for it in this manner, in this fashion. So I've had a great time with season 4. And I can't wait for season 5 in 2026, presumably. I really want to see how this show wraps up and where it goes. And I hope and pray that it sticks the landing, like I know that this show has the potential to do. So season 4 of The Boys, huge recommendation for me.